It will be very, very difficult for us to match the opening statements. We will try to go a little bit more practical and show you how law actually can be creative in solving some of the problems that organized civil society and those of us who would like to see social change can go forward. So I will not go through introduction of our panelists. You can find their bios on the website and as well as in the program. So I would probably like to ask Sylvia if you could start with telling us from your experience of your law practice, how you were supporting civil society and the experience you had in Poland.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for invitation. It's really a great honor to speak at the conference where more than 400 people gathered together just to make a world a better place. It's really great experience. And I'm sorry I just have to say that I was so inspired by your speech. I'm really touched by that, and really thank you, because I am also representing refugees from Chechnya who are subject to torture and very horrible things they went through. And your speech and your courage is really touching for me. Really thank you for that. And just to go to the subject, as you know, I'm from Poland, and now we are in Poland facing huge constitutional crisis and threat to democracy and threat to independence of the courts and threat to rule of law. So my view on strong civil society now is a little bit probably different than the view of my colleagues from Germany and the United States, not from Hungary very much, but from Germany and the United States it differs, because now we have to somehow prevent the rule of law and human rights in the circumstances we are in. So also the situation in Poland also reflects the situation of the third sector of the NGOs, because they are also struggling with difficulties. They are having either unexpected tax controls or unexpected searches in their premises, or their activists are facing criminal proceedings or other sanctions and difficulties. So we as lawyers feel responsible for this and to do everything to help them. And we know now more than ever that without strong civil society in Poland, we will not make any change whatsoever. So what we did on this very particular situation, we've created so-called Justice Defense Committee. We did that with 12 NGOs, mostly lawyers, Association of Judges, Amnesty International, Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights, and others, just to help not only lawyers and judges that are facing the disciplinary proceedings now in Poland, but also NGOs that may have difficulties because of the situation, that may not have any money now because the money was not anymore given to them by the state. It used to be given for years, but now NGOs is taking care of women's rights, refugees, LGBT, and other not very popular among governing party activities organizations. They are just facing the financial problems. So every NGO and every activist can help to the Justice Defense Committee and ask for help and ask for advice and ask for defending him or her before the court, in front of the court. So this is what we did in this as a first reaction to this very difficult situation in Poland, and this is definitely a new thing and very typical to a country that is facing this kind of difficulties. But also I want to say that the compliance is also playing the big role in respect of strong society, civil society. And what we also are doing, and we did with Centrum Pro Bono in Warsaw, we just thought that you can't look at the NGO only through the case in which it came to you. You have to look at the NGO as a whole picture, as the whole mechanism and organization, how it's work, how it's running business, and what you can improve in this organization, not only giving the advice, but it's working itself. So we did a couple of trainings on the labor law and other regulations that may help them to govern their organizations better. So how to hire people, how to fire people, how to deal with this typical business stuff. And giving them these tools, we know that we help them to run their businesses better and to implement the procedures inside their organization that may prevent them from the serious problems in the future. And also we did that in respect of the unexpected surge of the police in Poland. They also implemented. I personally trained many NGOs regarding that, and they also placed internal regulation regarding what to do, how to react once the police come and knock to the door and ask questions and ask for the files. It is extremely important to be ready because you never know when they may face any difficulties. So compliance, it's always a good solution, and this constant stable help for NGOs is also an answer. And the last thing, because I know I'm probably running out of time, the last thing I want to tell is the strategic litigation. Strategic litigation, it's really important thing. We do that a lot with Helsinki Foundation for human rights. It's really, the impact litigation can really change the law in any country. Once successful, it can get great results. It can get impact and to the government to change the law. I personally do that for the refugees with Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights. We did a couple of interventions and strategic litigation that are now implementing or should be implemented in a Polish law so far. So strategic litigation is also something I would like to underline and maybe discuss with you a little bit later.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. Now, before going to Balázs, who actually is heading Civil Liberties Union for Europe, I would like to ask now, you mentioned trainings, you mentioned compliance, and you mentioned specifically also strategic litigation. I'm not going to ask you still first, but I would like to ask Balázs, given the shortness of time. I know we discussed, and also yesterday you mentioned that there are some ways how law firms could support organized civil society. And given your experience, you were in Hungary before, working for 2 different organizations. Coming from your experience, what are actually the limits of what Sylvia mentioned?
Good morning, everyone. That's a really good question, but I don't like to talk about limits first, because that's a kind of negative context to this. Instead, let me answer this. We are talking about how to help NGOs, how to work with civil society organizations, how to advance human rights in restrictive environments, in countries, in regions where the so-called shrinking space for civil society became an issue, a rather worrying issue. And I think there are three kind of thoughts which could help us to understand what people like you, what pro bono lawyers could do in order to fight this back. The first is, and I'm talking about Europe because I'm leading a European organization, but I do believe that much of what I'm saying makes sense in other environments as well. So the first thing is the general perception of human rights. It's a sad fact, but it's actually true, that human rights has become a toxic brand in more than one country in Europe. Countries which were previously known as human rights champions are facing with large part of their voters' constituencies thinking badly about human rights. There are many reasons why this has happened, but the overall picture is this. We, as NGOs, and you also as pro bono lawyers, have to understand and have to let them understand, the public, that human rights are not only for the marginalized and not only for minorities. Of course, rights and liberties are there to protect the rights of marginalized and minorities, but it's extremely important that mainstream parts of the public should recognize again that fundamental rights, liberties are there to protect not only as individuals, but healthy democracies. So that's one. The second is, what is the role human rights and watchdog NGOs are playing in these countries? Because of historical, political, and many other reasons, in more than one countries, these watchdog NGOs, these critical organizations, became the checks and balances institutions themselves. If a country, if a government is attacking its constitutional court and changing its members, if a country making everything possible to attack the independence of the judiciary, if the country or its government is systematically breaking down rule of law institutions, then if in this country there are well-staffed, well-budgeted, and knowledgeable NGOs, watchdog NGOs, who work on civil liberties and human rights issues, and in no time they will find themselves in the center of political attention because what they are doing is political activity. It's not a bad thing. I do believe that working in politics and doing political things is actually the bread and butter of watchdog NGOs. That's what they do. But it's really important to understand what is the crucial role these groups are playing. And then the third thing is that we might think that the shrinking space phenomena is a legal issue. I really do believe that it is a political issue. It's really not about changing the legal environment. It's about why and how these NGOs find themselves in the center of attention, and why governments and states are attacking them. It might seem a legal issue, but it's not. It's political. Having said that, and this is to answer your question, Andre, this does not mean that lawyers and legal work cannot help these groups. There are a tremendous number of ways, really, how these groups could be helped. And I'm not asking you to go out and start petitions and be political, because I understand the limitations of the legal profession. But let me tell you just one example, because it really shows what I'm talking about. A few weeks ago in Hungary, I'm actually a Hungarian living in Berlin. A few weeks ago in Hungary, a new law came into effect which practically criminalized the homeless status. So being a homeless is actually a petty offense, a misdemeanor in these days in Hungary. There was really a lot of frustration, outcry, and protest against this law. So far, nothing has changed. But there was one single action which was actually started by lawyers, by attorneys, practicing attorneys, and that was a very powerful political petition signed today more than 3,000 lawyers. Again, I'm talking about practicing attorneys who normally don't do these kind of things, asking the courts to use their power, to use their constitutional power to scrutinize this legislation and do what they can do. Literally days after that petition was started and went viral in social media, the first decisions to acquit some of the defendants and the first decisions from the courts turning in the actual procedures to the Constitutional Court had happened. And it really shows me that there are times when lawyers, and I also mean all kind of lawyers, need to show that compassion and conscience are also very important parts of the legal profession. Thank you.
Thank you, Balázs. So we already have a number of examples of where lawyers and law firms can help and support civil society. Now I would like to go to Owen, to you. If you could tell us a little bit more of specifically looking at the relationship between the private sector and civil society. What other examples do you see where they could come together and support social change?
So I think that the panelists have already told you that civil society has ways of reacting when it is under attack. But what's interesting about as you think about engaging with law firms is to think about what law firms do for their paying clients. Law firms very rarely, for their paying clients, think only in straight lines. If you really want to help your paying clients, you think asymmetrically. You think about more than one line. You think about more than one angle of attack. And I think there are things that private law firms can do that people don't often think of that we do for our paying clients all the time. For example, some specific examples. When civil society is under attack in a country, and for example, let's say the attacks are all of a sudden your bank won't process payments. because they're afraid of money laundering laws or changes in law relating to compliance. Well, the frontal assault is to try to deal with the bank in country. But one of the things to think about is dealing with the bank outside the country. Using relationships that lawyers may have with that bank outside of a specific country to begin intermediating and getting people outside the country to call their colleagues in country and say, now wait a second. There are ways of complying with this law and checking the box without shutting down the payment stream of an NGO. And so one of the things a private law firm can do is change the focus, is change the focal point of the problem. Another example of what private law firms can do is when we're faced with attacks on civil society, one of the interesting questions when these regulations get passed is, do they have a spillover effect? Might they unwittingly, right? We're lawyers. We all the time see things spilling over from one area to another because government drafts legislation poorly or government drafts regulation poorly. Well, if government is beginning to do things aimed at hurting civil society, but lawyers can make a decent argument to the private sector that this will end up hurting you too, then all of a sudden you change your alliances. Then all of a sudden you change the dialogue. You change the vocabulary of the debate. And all of a sudden civil society may find itself with unwitting allies. And it may not work in every case, but it would surprise me, especially the broader the attack, that governments won't mess up. They will make mistakes, and the mistakes will have spillover effects, and at that point you can begin changing the nature of the interaction and who will help civil society. It also changes the way you approach strategic litigation. All of a sudden it's not just civil society against government, now it's the private sector saying to the government, this is going to hurt us too. Another thing that lawyers can do very effectively is lawyers can create safe spaces for civil society to engage with entities they might normally not engage with, for example, the private sector, who may not always be helpful, or even government itself. There are very few, we talk about the private sector as if it's monolithic, but it isn't. We talk about government as if it's monolithic, but it isn't. I'm the chairman of an NGO that goes around the world training government officials in genocide and mass atrocity prevention. And over the last 10 years, we've trained over 4,000 government officials from over 80 countries. Now, many of those 80 countries do not have good human rights records, but yet there are officials within those governments who want to somehow incrementally effect change in their societies, in their structures. And that change is going to be slow, it's going to be incremental, it's going to be painfully inadequate in the short term, but in the long term it might be meaningful. Well, one of the things we do is we create a safe space. We don't name and shame, and whatever gets said at our seminars stays at our seminars. So it's almost like the OECD except in an NGO context. But the lesson from that is that private law firms can do the same thing. Private law firms may help NGOs identify people within governments or people within certain ministries who don't necessarily specifically follow the party line, who may understand how hurting NGOs will ultimately hurt business in a society, may ultimately hurt the economy in a society. There are ways that lawyers can present paths of communication that NGOs might not otherwise have. And the other thing that lawyers can do, you know, when you deal with a private law firm, you're changing the nature of your network. There are lawyers in countries that are going to sit on foundation boards, on donor boards. They're going to know companies. They're going to know people on company boards. They're going to know investors. And you don't know whether they may know somebody who can help you change the debate, who can help you change your approach to a problem. And I often find that NGO clients don't even ask these questions. What's interesting is paying clients ask these questions all the time because they're paying, so they feel they're entitled to the service. You guys need to act like you're more entitled to the service because the fact is private lawyers can bring a lot to the table if you push them and if you challenge them to tell you things you don't know. That's the key for you. Tell me things I don't know. Give me a different way of thinking about the problem, especially an asymmetric way of thinking of the problem. And that's sort of the way I see it.
Owen, thank you so much, especially for relatively optimistic view of the private sector. And before I welcome questions on that, I would like to ask Stephanie, and thank you, Stephanie, for joining us on this. With your experience using technology, especially to support civil society, what's your view on where are we? I mean, you know, now we discussed a little bit the political threats and how they translate also in the legal environment and how the lawyers can support. But I would like to hear from you both on what are the threats and opportunities from where you see it. And I know that you've also worked on how technology is affecting the input into the political process in the elections. So please, what do you see from where you stand?
Sure. It's an interesting thing. Sorry, I'm a practitioner. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm really honored to be here. But it's going to be a slightly different perspective, probably. But I hope that's relevant and important. I think it's important for us because whatever we do in our work, working with civil society groups all over the world on their use of technology, we come up against the law all the time, probably not surprisingly to you all. I guess I want to say that when I started my work looking at the use of technology by civil society globally, mostly human rights defenders at that time and journalists, I think the kinds of examples of technology that we had in the keynote speech were exactly why we started that work. You know, you saw that the use of text, even just simple technology, were super important in keeping people connected, finding them a way out, a lifeline, and even thank you for the examples, the great one of the comic as well, and the kind of mobile phone bringing these issues to life, are the kinds of reasons that we started this work. Of course, not surprising to you all, probably, as soon as we started helping human rights groups or people working on corruption, investigative journalists, lawyers working with those kinds of groups, to use these technologies effectively, we essentially had a problem with exposure. So the moment you start using these tools for important ways of connecting people, they become a target as well for those people who are using those tools. So thankfully that didn't happen in the cases we saw this morning, but we see lots of cases where people rely on their mobile phones or their email or their WhatsApp messages or their Facebook messages, and those become ways to expose individuals. Not just through themselves as individuals, but also their entire networks as well. So, I mean, I guess I would say what I see is that technology has become both a lifeline and still is a lifeline in these contexts, but it's also a trap. And what we see in that regard is, and why this is very relevant to the shrinking space discussion, I think, is that these technologies are just an extension of the current political moment. So whatever you see offline, like harassment of women journalists, women politicians, women lawyers, it's just extended online. Or whatever you see in terms of attempts to entrap organizations, for example, looking at their accounts, financial records or whatever, it will just be extended on the online space. And as we get more and more dependent on those tools, that's a more and more critical issue. I think the other thing is the kind of, there's a time for a sort of wake-up process in that, where organizations, I think including law firms who work with these organizations and individuals, need to be very aware of the traces that they're leaving. And that's specifically because of the political situation. Something that's okay today isn't okay tomorrow, or something that was okay 2 years ago, or people you wanted to be associated with 2 years ago, suddenly you don't want to be associated with them. And those digital traces are really hard to remove and erase. Some of the work we've done at my organization, Tactical Tech, is looking at these issues. For example, even at a conference like this, the organizers tend to use, I haven't looked at this organization, so I'm not necessarily saying this conference, but they'll tend to use very cheap off-the-shelf tools to organize you all to get here, which is great. And it's this convenient thing where you can just register, sign in, you get all the details sent to you by email. But unfortunately, that also leaves a very clear database of everybody in this space when they came together at the same time. And if you imagine that with a different group of people, that might be really problematic. So that's why we see the traces issue changing. So these tools become a kind of a way of gathering evidence on people. For example, we saw just 2 weeks ago Tunisian men being arrested on suspicion of being gay, and their mobile phones is the first thing that's removed from them to prove that they're gay, to see who else they're connected to. So we see it as evidence gathering, let's say. We see it as leaving traces, but we also see it as a channel for harassment and intimidation of individuals, including lawyers as well. I'm going to just say that one of the things that people always say is, surely you can just train them. Just give them extra tools, give them a different phone, give them something that you can do to protect themselves. And it might be worth just mentioning at this point that the state and the police are usually way ahead of that curve when it comes to that. What we see now is increasingly activists being the evidence against them being the fact that they are using encryption or they are using tools that close things down. And even the people who train them being arrested. There was a case in Turkey last year where 2 digital security trainers working with human rights activists were arrested on charges of terrorism. So even the tools that we are supposed to have to reduce these risks are very difficult to use, if not then used as incriminating evidence against activists. And I guess I'll just say one last thing, because I guess we should move on to the discussion part. But Andre asked me to mention the work that I've been doing on looking at the use of data and technology in elections around the world. So one of the things we've been doing is a research project looking at 20 different countries around the world. Obviously, you probably would have been hiding in the last 6 months if you hadn't heard of Cambridge Analytica, if you hadn't heard of the problem of personal data use in elections around the world. And this is a project that we started 2 years ago looking at this question. What we found is that Cambridge Analytica, whilst an important case, is just one example. There are 250 to 300 other companies that we've been documenting doing exactly the same kind of work, not all of it, but some of it. And that's a practice that's taking place in countries around the world, and we're looking at different regions. It's an important issue because the way in which those technologies are being used also in the democratic process is changing. And I guess I'll just leave a flag that we maybe come back to, which is some of my work has been working with the British government and in the Houses of Parliament, House of Lords, to help politicians understand these issues. And that's really important. And the reason for that is threefold. One is governments are mostly advised by companies about how the technology works. They have no independent voice in that process. If you just look at the US hearings of how Mark Zuckerberg was interviewed, if any of you have watched those, you'll see that the politicians had no idea what to ask. They were asking all the wrong questions. And thirdly, those companies are then taking that as an opportunity to self-regulate. And in the context of elections, that's not a good outcome. So we can talk about more if that's relevant. But
Stephanie, thank you so much. I mean, I think, first of all, prepare your questions. We do have time for questions, and I would like to take a couple of questions before I reflect a little bit. So what we see here, it's different examples of how the balance of power is changing, essentially between the organized civil society, the regulators, and the private market. Stephanie, thanks a lot for this last example, because I think it's really visible how basically the regulators find it super difficult to regulate part of the private sector, but we also see that the relationship translating into very complicated situations in other sectors. Do we immediately have any questions before I go? Because otherwise we could have another round, but then I'm afraid that we won't have enough time for questions. In that case, let me do another round. Specifically, Sylvia, when you were providing the support for civil society, what were some of the elements that you found particularly challenging when you wanted to help the organized civil society? What were some of the obstacles that you had to actually go through to be able to provide that help?
Well, I totally agree with your attitude. The main obstacle maybe at the beginning that the NGO is not really realizing that it needs a lawyer, or the activist that it needs a lawyer. So this is the main message, that once you're in trouble, you go to lawyer. And one thing that the NGOs is remembered after this training about searches in their premises and interrogation, at the very beginning I told them, okay, first thing you have to do, you call your advocate. This is the first thing. And there were other stuff, very complicated regulations, and one by one, and all they remember, and I know that because I went in to help them in case of those searches, they only remember that call my lawyer is the most important thing. But so the main obstacle at the very beginning is they have to be aware that the legal help at the very beginning, it's crucial, because those are golden minutes that you may miss, and your case will be much more difficult than it could have been once you asked the lawyer at the beginning.
Thank you so much. Balázs, you mentioned specifically 3 examples how the lawyers could help. Would you prioritize between those? Like, where do you think that currently, because some of those, the lawyers are already helping a little bit. Where would you find it particularly useful if more of the law firms or even individual lawyers would join in?
I mean, I don't want to delegate the task of developing new narratives around human rights that I think it's not necessarily the task of lawyers. But one thing I can think of which would be pretty useful from our perspective is to think about a little bit more strategic and more developed relationships between law firms and NGOs, because the little segment what I see from this, NGOs asking pro bono help is very often happening on a case-by-case basis. Everyone is busy. I don't think NGO activists are, especially in this respect, but these are usually overloaded, undersourced organizations with limited human resources and limited focus. So everyone is running around, and everyone needs help. And when they need help, they need really quickly that help. And when they are turning to their pro bono partners, and then very often the actual yes or no is decided on a case-by-case individual basis. And that's fine. I understand, especially since if you are talking about shrinking space issues, if you are talking about attacks against NGOs, 99% of those attacks are coming from governments now. The bigger a law firm is, the bigger the chances that, in a specific country they will have some kind of contracts with government. So again, I'm aware of conflict of interest issues. But what I'm talking about, if we would be able to sit down and talk about the future and develop certain projects together, which would give a larger share of ownership to both parties, in which lawyers would be able to say that, okay, so here I am. It's not only due diligence and compliance, and I'm not saying not only, because these are extremely important issues, but let's say I'm able to help you. I'm able to help your work on, let's say, freedom of expression, and then the firm would be able to look for partners or lawyers who are interested in those issues, and that would give them time to prepare. That would be a fabulous step. And honestly, I don't really see this happening on a sectoral level. Probably there are good examples, and I would be pleased to hear them. But I'm pretty sure that if we could talk about this second phase relationship between NGOs and law firms, that would be a great step forward.
Thank you, Balázs. I mean, we talk a lot about social change, but sometimes it is also about preventing social change. I mean, now with the recent quote from Chancellor Merkel, who said that the foundational human rights conventions would be impossible to enact these days, it's a great reminder of how much actually, we are not even struggling to be more progressive and move forward as much as we are actually protecting of what do we have right now. So in this respect, your reminder, Balázs, of how actually law firms could be more proactive and could help us, but also I see in this process a good opportunity for PILnet to facilitate this role and this relationship. So I do appreciate. Now, Owen, you mentioned you were very optimistic about the role of private sector, and I'm really grateful for that. Now, from Stephanie, we heard that it's not all that rosy at the same time. So why do we actually see much more of cooperation with the private sector? And let me be a little bit more provocative on that. We have specific countries where the environment, the operating environment for organized civil society is becoming much more difficult, but the private sector seems to be thriving. We have new investments, even from Germany, coming to Central Europe, while the civil society in Central Europe is struggling, and we have major actors of organized civil society leaving Central Europe. How can this be?
Well, I think the easy answer is, again, the private sector, markets are not monolithic. The private sector is not monolithic. You talk about the misuse of data with regard to civil society and with regard to privacy, but yet at the same time we live in an age when the Carter Center recently put out a paper about how using metadata off of the internet they were able to map human rights violations in Syria much faster than prosecutorial authorities who were trying to mobilize that data. And there's an interesting piece from someone at West Point on the same idea, which actually pointed out that there are 2.5 million cell phones in North Korea, which I found fascinating because if that's true, why aren't we bombarding them with the same robocalls that I get every day? Because that, to me, would be the easiest way to undermine that government quickly. But what that tells you is, we're living in an age, where for every push there's a pull. And so I think when you look at private sector actors moving into places like Eastern Europe, and you look at civil society being under attack, one of the ways to look at that is that, yes, it's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. Because it means you've got fresh money, fresh minds, perhaps younger minds, younger investors, maybe millennial investors who take a different view of human rights than older investors, and a more pro-human rights approach. And so the point is, what private law firms can offer is a different way of thinking of that market. And are there opportunities in that space to begin challenging the private sector to understand that in the long run, the destruction of civil society or the hobbling of civil society will cost them money. It will hurt economic chances, it will hurt return on investment, and in the long run it will hurt their products and their businesses. And so again, I think that the key thing that private lawyers can help NGOs do, and I agree with the message, you're not alone, call your lawyer. Be as demanding as paying clients. And talk to your lawyers about strategy, about your business. NGOs are businesses too. Think about your business. Think about your short-term, your medium-term, and your long-term. And challenge your lawyers to help you find new ways in, because even in bad times, the market is never monolithic. It's just a pendulum that's going through an arc. And that's, I think, the way you have to look at it. So I'm not a cockeyed optimist. I'm only sort of a historical optimist.
I think it's helpful to actually see the opportunity and the optimism here. Stefanie, going back to you, told us about a lot of the challenges and how technology makes us vulnerable. Do you see opportunities for lawyers to help us manage some of those risks that people who are using technology for social change face?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things, though, is being aware of how it works, and that's one of the hardest things, I think. There's been a lot of emphasis, for example, in the change in laws in Europe on GDPR, so the change to better data protection laws in Europe, for example. And a lot of emphasis on consent, the idea that, I've agreed to that, I understood that, and so on. And I think that when you look at how the technology works, when you look at how the data flows, it's almost impossible for people to understand how it works. Even when you look at the edge of that, it's very clear. Most of the responsibility, if you look at something like consent and young people, for example, on use of technology, it's moved to the parent, the consent, in the legal system. And in that context, it's kind of useless because the parents have no idea what they're agreeing to. In fact, we do lots of training with young people, and their biggest outcome of some of the workshops we do is they say, we want to teach our parents how the technology works, and kind of approve what they're saying yes and no to. And so I just think that's an example of how incredibly difficult it is, because we can say, we should be more aware, we should understand how it works, lawyers should understand the risks, but in the reality check is that you have to be a kind of technologist to understand that, and we're trying to bridge that gap, and it's a difficult one, I think. I think the other thing that I see, just jumping back to the other discussion we were having about the legal framework around the use of digital campaigning in elections, what I see in that context is a really mixed response from governments and from lawyers and regulators in that context. In my work in the UK, what I see is regulators very keen to embrace some of these questions, but being so far behind the curve. So you've got now in the UK, for example, a case finally, a possible criminal case investigation against Aaron Banks, who's the so one of the very instrumental people in UKIP, which is the right-wing party, and had funded some of the initiatives, the Leave initiatives, to leave the European Union. And only now, so many years later, is there a case being brought against him for not only investing in sort of interfering, if you like, in the process of leaving the European Union for the UK, but also allegedly for using insurance data from his own insurance company to directly campaign to individuals. And it's only now that the Electoral Commission has handed over the case for a larger scale inquiry. And so what we find in our conversations with them is they start out by saying, look, it's all the same. We've always done individual influence. This is just a kind of step up in technology, it's all the same. And then when we sit down with them and say, okay, do you know about these 40 methods that are being used? Do you understand how this technology is working? They sit back and say, okay, can you come and train our staff? We've got no idea what we're doing. And so I think one of the things that needs to happen is, even in that context, perhaps there's an awareness that needs to happen, which to say, again, I don't want to make this about technology. I think when you mention that word, people immediately go, oh, that's nothing to do with me. I'm not a technologist. But I think the case I'm trying to make is it's so intricately connected to the way we all live and work now. And not only that, but it is so political, as you were saying about the shrinking space issue as well, on many different levels that we can't really avoid it anymore.
Thanks a lot for this reminder. I mean, often we do get scared by technology, but probably without the printing press, which is a sort of technology, we couldn't imagine universal, elections and democracy as we know it right now. Sylvia.
I just want to quickly build on that, what you said. Private sector can be very helpful and use only not lawyers but also managers, because they're a great source of knowledge. And I know the program in Poland where managers, CEOs or other chiefs of the departments are meeting with the chief of the NGO every week or every month and discuss with them their business, what they want to achieve, the big picture, how to run the finance system in the NGO. This is really a good solution. And what we did as the Cliffordians, I've asked my financial manager to meet with one of the NGOs to help them to understand that once they've started their business and they were like 5 people, it's not the same now because they're 100 and they still have the same procedures and the same way of thinking. And this is really good example. So use the managers of the private companies because they're extremely useful.
I would probably build on that. My idea from also my experience with civil society was that it would be wonderful if senior people experienced from private sector would go on and join boards of organized civil society organizations, whether it's foundations or associations, because often just the ability to see what non-profits are able to do with the tremendous little resources they have is, on one hand, it's really eye-opening, and it also would help to bring the language and the networks that people from private sector have, not only for fundraising, but I think it's also for seeing the tools that non-profits could rely on that the private sector is actually using. I would again like to welcome questions from the audience. I mean, we have a wonderful question. Please wait for the microphone.
Hi, Joe Weiss, White and Case. Really interesting panel, and I love that you have Stephanie here. I'm feeling the need for a media voice, and I wonder if the panelists would like to comment on how print and broadcast media, not social media, because that's been part of your theme, are making it worse, closing the space for civil society, and what specifically their social responsibility should be, keeping in mind the freedom of the press, right? That's the problem. How do you walk that line? But media companies are causing a lot of problems in my country for sure. And I'd love to see us figure out how to bring them into this room and get them on board.
Thank you so much for this question. I'm looking at Balázs. You had some very painful experience with media. I'm not calling you on to tell us about it, but if you could reflect on this question.
Yes, I mean, remember what I said about human rights becoming a toxic brand. I mean, one example is actually the UK, where, in the whole Brexit discussion, if I can call that a discussion, the role of tabloid media, how they were actually using the European Court of Human Rights and the certain verdicts of that court, which has really nothing to do with the European Union, to be used as a number one argument why the UK should leave the EU. I think it's a really good question, and frankly, I'm not sure what we can do with that. On the positive note, however, what I said about the role of NGOs, it's not only that they are increasingly political, but it's also they are increasingly more effective, and they are able to communicate much better and more effectively to much larger audiences than before. If you just think about what was the way how filmmaking was done, let's say 10 years ago, what was the way an activist group was able to create a movie about anything 10 years ago, and how is that happening now? Simply using cell phones and practically free editing softwares. And I know it wasn't about social media, but what I'm saying is that these social groups today have really cost-effective and pretty amazing tools to communicate. And my central thinking here is that the world of communication and media is changing so rapidly, and we have no idea what is going to be the business model of the still existing large international or national papers. But it would be extremely important to recognize who are our partners in these social fights within the existing media environment, and that would be crucial. It's not only, and it's really there is a mutual relationship. NGOs can help journalists to be better informed and serve as experts, but I know a range of European countries where freedom of speech advocates and watchdog groups are on a daily basis helping journalists to defend them, but also not only in freedom of expression cases, but also in freedom of information cases. It would be great to understand if any of the big law firms or any of the experienced pro bono lawyers are willing to take part in that work, because it really takes a difference when someone with your experience is able to stand on the bench and defend those activists and those journalists.
Thank you, Balázs. It's really useful, both the partnerships, but also how the media can further support the work of NGOs. Stephanie.
Yeah, I just briefly want to connect what I was talking about with the question, which I think was a really great question, which is I would be really aware of the fact that we really need independent media in that context of civil society space, which I think is where your question was coming from. And I think the link with what I've been talking about is what most independent media is feeling right now is that they're being entirely squeezed out by the social media companies, by the way they take away the advertising revenue. So I just think there's a direct link actually between the power of most of those advertising dollars now go to social media companies, mostly Facebook and Google, and that does actually squeeze out independent media in a really significant way, and that has a direct connection, I think, to the current state of things in the context of shrinking space.
Thank you so much. Unless you want to reflect still on this question, I don't see any hands raising, but I would like to give... Oh, okay. Please, Bob, if you can get a mic.
Thank you. I'd just like to follow up on the media question. Recently I met with a very interesting individual. He's a professor of journalism from Duke University. His name is Bill Adair. Besides being a professor of journalism, he is also the head of a nonprofit. One of the major missions of it is to help establish beyond the United States NGOs that effectively fight fake news and fact check. And I'm just curious to know whether you, within the jurisdictions that you have worked in or are working in, are there organizations that do this fake news, if you will, fact checking? And the name of his group is PolitiFact, and I'm just curious to know whether you know anything about them.
Yeah, sure. There are quite a few organizations doing that. I think it's a really important role. There are many of them that come from a journalism background, and then they've decided to focus just on this. And there are several of them, some of them specializing in certain countries, some of them working globally, and some of them using actually technology to verify things, and some of them not. There's also initiatives where, so those are kind of independent fact checkers, and then there are also initiatives where they actually organize citizens to report possible fake news as well. So there are lots of different initiatives with, I would say, quite a lot of innovation in that space right now. Even in Latin America, for example, really interesting projects getting individuals to report, for example, through WhatsApp, when they think they've seen some fake news. I think so those countermeasures are really important, but at the end of the day, I feel like the accountability of those companies is really essential. I've been working with some of the policy and communications folks at WhatsApp, for example, at Facebook, and there's a complete disconnect between their own responsibility in that space and the actual actions that are happening. And I think that so much attention has been on Facebook, they've kind of ducked it. But I think WhatsApp, especially in the global south, is a much more disruptive tool actually than Facebook. Because it's not used the way it's used in Europe, it's used en masse in groups. And it goes under the radar because, unlike Facebook, it's not public. It's something that people use between each other in a way nobody else can monitor. So the fact-checking is important, but we have to spread it, and we have to find ways of making those companies accountable when things fly under the radar. If we regulate, for example, and shut down some of the media, it'll just move to those closed spaces like WhatsApp.
Thank you so much. Balázs, do you still want to briefly come in?
Sure. We don't do fact-checking, but we are engaged in a work which is called a shadow legal task force to regulate fake news. The EU recently created a task force to propose regulation around this issue. Sadly, none of the free speech advocates or none of the big free speech organizations made it to the task force. It's a very awkward process how they select who should be in, who should be represented. So we, together with other NGOs, decided that this is a way too important issue just to miss the early phase of the regulation. So we've created this task force, and we are proposing, we just issued a report last week, and we are proposing measures how to counteract this, and we will strongly monitor what is happening with the regulation process. You know, one of the strategies we as Liberties are always keen to do is to provide realistic policy alternatives. NGOs, and I'm sorry for all the NGO activists in the room, are very often known to be able to say, no, this is unacceptable, and that's the end of the story. We really like to step one step forward, and we always propose realistic policy solutions and policy alternatives, and that's the case with the fake news regulation as well.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think that we've managed to give you a tasting within this 1 hour, this wonderful 4 speakers. I'm very glad that we finished with 2 examples of productive partnership with both regulators as well as with the private sector. I would like to invite you for a coffee break to continue the discussion and look into the agenda. We have specific sessions that will drill deeper into some of these topics that we gave you the tasting. Thank you so much.